I want to speak to you today about a little considered aspect of early modern Indo-Islamic intellectual history that then I'll connect to modern Urdu intellectual history in the 20th century. This talk comes out of a new book project that is still in its early stages. This was really what I've been interested in for a second book project, and this is, right now I'm thinking about it as a project looking at the development, growth, rise of new forms of economic literacy in North India in the long 19th century context. For me, the connection to law is there's one sort of embodied connection, as with a figure like Iqbal. A lot of Indian nationalists, lawyers, nationalist figures, especially people who are getting interested in economics in the early 20th century, are also barristers trained in law. And of course, there's a long history to connections between legal and economic ideas. Of course, in the West, we know those well. Obviously, in other contexts as well, law and economics go together. Going back, obviously, most clearly to Adam Smith, a person interested in jurisprudence, of course, in Islamic thought as well. There's all sorts of connections. So in terms of like how I got to this interest, that's kind of the genesis of it. What I'll do, I guess, when I was first thinking of this talk, I was thinking of focusing exclusively on Iqbal, and then I thought maybe I would try to give you a broader picture into some of the questions and themes I also want to explore through this book, through this project. So in the first half of the talk, I'll focus more on what I mean by economic literacy and some of the ways it was made concrete in the political and commercial cultures of early modern North India. And then in the second half, I'll turn to Iqbal. Let me just switch slides. I'll try to recover for you a different image of Iqbal than the one most people with some familiarity or a lot of familiarity with him would have, which would be as either a poet, a famed Persian poet, an Islamic modernist, or maybe an Indian nationalist, maybe the founder of Pakistan. I'll try to recover an image of Iqbal as an economic thinker, or more properly, a person who's translating Anglophone political economy texts and teaching political economy in Lahore in the early part of the 20th century. Okay, so to make sense of how economic literacy was changing in North India, I've organized the presentation into these 4 sections. In section 1, let me just get my timer up. Sorry, I don't like speaking without it. Okay, so in section 1, I start with a brief survey of how scholars have approached historicizing our modern ways of economic knowing. In section 2 and 3, I then discuss economic literacy in late Indo-Islamic times under the Mughals briefly. Here I consider different forms of calculative rationality that early modern economic literacy was built on. Let me just say that by calculative rationality, I mean the use of enumerative and quantitative reasoning in provisioning for society's material needs. And then finally in section 4, I come to Iqbal's Ilm-ul-Iqtesad, the science of economics, a 1904 text that was part of a longer, importantly, sequence of efforts that I won't have time to talk about today, but to translate Western political economy texts going back into Urdu, going back to at least the 1840s. So there I'll also reach my overall conclusion for the purposes of the talk, which is that a text like Iqbal's can only be understood in terms of 2 different tasks of translation. So a first between English and Urdu, and then a second between 2 different languages of modern economic science that were alive in his day, and which we now call the classical and the neoclassical. Okay, so with that, let me come to the first section. Now, in recent years, a growing number of scholars have become interested in the origins of our modern idea of the economy. Now, interestingly, most of these have not been historians of economics or even economic historians as such. Rather, as Tim Mitchell puts it, the focus on the quote-unquote invention of the economy is tied up with the competing legacies of Foucault and Karl Polanyi. For Foucault, for example, the economy assumed distinct existence in the West only in the late 18th century, and its emergence was connected to what he called the rise of governmentality, out of which he argued both the modern state and the modern social sciences were formed, including classical political economy after Adam Smith. Mitchell, in contrast, disagrees about dating, and he sees the quote-unquote economy as coming into being only in the 1930s as new kinds of technocratic expertise and calculative capacities came together under a more fully bureaucratized form of the nation state. Now, whatever their differences, these views share in the idea that our modern and ostensibly scientific way of economic knowing can't be understood just internally through the economists' concepts and theories. Rather, the scientific content of economic knowledge has also been built on certain external socio-historical preconditions. Of course, this divide is not unique to historicizing our modern way of economic knowing. It tracks a more basic conflict that you see depicted here between internalist versus externalist approaches to the history of ideas in general and to the history of science in particular. But what does make the history of modern economic knowing unique, I think, is the intensity with which the internalism-externalism conflict raises its head here. That is because the economy is not simply historically contingent in the sense that it became thought of as a distinct object of inquiry only with the rise of new intellectual frameworks clarifying its study. Rather, historical contingency made the economy by giving rise to shifting relations of production, novel technology and energy profiles, and new institutions of market exchange that increasingly made it seem there was a distinct realm of experience worth calling by its name. So in this sense, I would say, bracketing the question of how scientific is modern economics, there's, in a sense, a greater discontinuity, I would argue, between our modern forms of economic knowing and our quote-unquote pre-modern ones than would be the case in any of the other natural sciences. Say, if you're thinking about the obvious sort of break or discontinuity between modern chemistry and, corpuscularianism combining with alchemy, and then somehow, after Boyle and Lavoisier, somehow turning into modern chemistry. There's obviously some kind of break there too, analogously with biology, with natural history somehow transitioning into biology. How do you understand that kind of transition process? And I think there's, in a way, an even more sharp break in the realm of economic knowing. Again, bracketing the question of how scientific is modern economics, which of course it likes to brandish that reputation of itself. So it's plausible, if it's plausible to suggest that even in the West there was no distinct analytical domain of the economy prior to the late 18th or even late 19th century, let alone one that was there to be known scientifically, then how should we understand what I'm calling economic literacy prior to the colonial period in South Asia? What were the genres of knowing associated with the production, distribution, and exchange of material sustenance that characterized a world like Mughal North India's and that formed a part of the inheritance of Iqbal and his predecessors translating 19th century economics texts into Urdu? To address this, I'll now turn to what I'll call, to exemplify what I'm talking about, two genres of calculative rationality through which economic literacy was concretely exemplified in the political and commercial cultures of Mughal times. Now, before doing that, I want to just bracket another issue. Now, for anyone interested in the history of economic ideas, you might know the great Austrian economist who also doubled as a historian of economic ideas, Joseph Schumpeter. Joseph Schumpeter had sort of a thesis associated with him of sort of a great gap in the history of economic ideas where you don't really have any kind of genuinely, what he called economic analysis as opposed to economic ideology, until really after Adam Smith. You have some of it with the Greeks. Now, for people who are interested in the Middle East, Islamic studies, I mean, the Great Gap theory is somehow, has often become a particular point of friction in that there's a whole, sequence, body, like with so much of the classical Hellenistic inheritance of Islamic thought that's somehow kind of wading into these same areas. And for Schumpeter, I mean, he's barely willing to credit the Greeks, he's barely willing to credit Adam Smith. He apparently didn't discover Ibn Khaldun until the end of his life. So anyway, there's this great gap theory that says economic analysis begins only in the 19th century, really, with some precursors in Greek thought, Greek ideas about the oikos, the oikonomia, those kinds of ideas. Now, there's a separate question coming off of, or sort of discounting Schumpeter's kind of view. Of course, the question that I'm going to discuss two genres of economic literacy or calculative rationality, but there's a whole bunch of other genres I'm not going to discuss. So this is another thing I'm bracketing. And I think I was anticipating, people here might be particularly interested in some of these other genres. But of course, there are ways in which you can think of the inheritance of Islamic intellectual production about economic and political ideas as a form of economics. So here's sort of one way you might do this. Again, this is not what I'm going to focus on, but I just wanted to sort of offer this picture. So you could think about, the literature of Tadbir in its sort of various forms that would get you ideas about governing the state. You could think of the Hispa literature about sort of regulating the marketplace, and you could construct a sequence like this, which scholars have, where you say, hey, this is a way we fill that great gap. Somebody like Schumpeter, or for that matter anyone else who's denying this heritage, is making the classical sort of Orientalist mistake of not really understanding the complexity of this thought, and they're giving, they're really assuming kind of a modern epistemology of what economics even is. So you have a very different sort of way of construing things if you want to look at these genres as summing to a form of economics. Of course, you could even just look at something like the great, Wheel of Justice, the Great Wheel of Justice itself as a variety, a system of political economy, indirectly at least, insofar as it's outlining some image of a social order. So again, I'm bracketing these, and I'm not at all denying that these two are visions of the economic, and in a sense you could count them as pre-modern forms of economics. And this, just giving sort of Ibn Khaldun's version of sort of what the different quadrants consist of. Of course, with Ibn Khaldun as well, you don't even, if you want to find economic thought in Ibn Khaldun, you don't have to go to his, representation of this sort of image of society. You could just sort of go more directly to his thoughts about value, his other thoughts about sort of economic matters as such. But again, I'm going to sort of bracket these for the time being, and instead turn to two other genres or examples. So in this first slide, what you see is a page depicting a tax table from one of the great administrative manuals of early modern Islamic imperium, the Ain-i-Akbari, which is sometimes known as the Institutes or Constitution of Akbar. And Akbar, of course, was the most renowned of the Mughal emperors and ruled from 1556 to 1605. The key figure in systematizing Mughal administration, Akbar was also famous for his ecumenical and syncretic religious attitudes. The Ain, which comprised multiple volumes, was itself one of 3 volumes, of course, in a larger work called the Akbarnameh, or the Book of Akbar. Authored by Akbar's vizier Abu al-Faisal, the Ain was many things, including part universal history, part historical ethnography of the subcontinent, and part statistical atlas with quantitative information about agricultural production. In this last respect, the Ain's purpose came from Akbar's desire to perfect the Mughal revenue regime. And as for what you're seeing here in this slide, this is one of the tables from Abu al-Faisal that Abu al-Fazl presents in parts of the Ain, laying out 19 years of taxation rates for the 12 subas of the empire that comprised the empire during Akbar's reign. After a narrative discussion of the several classes of soil into which land was divided based on productivity, and more specifically based on how long it could be kept in production without lying fallow, Abu al-Fazl presents a series of tables like this one that you see. He presents them for the 2 main harvest seasons. Now the first of those seasons, of course, was the Rabi, or as was known in Hindi, the Asadi, consisting of spring harvest crops like wheat and barley, and the second was the Kharif, or in Hindi it was known as the Sawani, and that consisted of the monsoon crops like rice and millet that were harvested in early winter. Now this particular table is for the Rabi harvest of the province of Agra, which was, of course, the Suba where Delhi and also Akbar's other capitals at Fatehpur Sikri were also located in that same province. Now the column on the leftmost side of the table shows the type of crop. The first row is for gandam or wheat, the second and third for Kabuli versions of versus Indian varieties of nakhud, which was a fodder plant, vetch as it's known in English, the fourth for barley or jaw, and so on. And the various columns to the left then record 19 years of annual data starting from the 6th year of Akbar's reign, so from 1560 to 1601, until the 24th. And tax amounts here are enumerated in 1/40th of a rupee account units called dams, and the rates are standardized for a class of land known as pelage, which could be kept continuously, basically in cultivation, without lying fallow at all, and on a per bighah basis, a unit of area that varied across India, but that would have been about 1/4 of an acre. Now, depicted in this next slide is a page from a ledger providing data on correspondences between areas under cereal grain cultivation and price measures per certain weights of the sown crop. And most of the document is written in a prominent North Indian commercial script known as Mahajani, which belongs to a broader category of merchant writing systems used in the Punjab, known as Landa or tailless scripts. From the introductory portion of the page, you can probably get a sense of how the Mahajani script looks compared to other more familiar Indic, Brahmi scripts, and also, of course, the Indo-Islamic, Perso-Arabic scripts. Mahajani does a few things like dropping out representation of vowels. It's sort of a more curvilinear script. There's also in this table various notations like the curling understroke and the three-stroke figure that are there to spell out fractional quantities and other types of quantitative elements. The three-stroke, the curling understroke is a currency figure, apparently. This script, of course, is still not deciphered by scholars like a lot of the other Landa scripts, though. Mahajani was used especially to encode languages like Punjabi, Marwari, and what we now call Hindi or Urdu. And I say encode because Mahajani was not just a system of writing. Instead, insofar it was mainly used by mercantile specialists for keeping accounts and creating financial instruments, it was also a way of representing part of the social world, that would have otherwise remained unknowable. In this sense, Mahajani was more a language than a script, and its use can be thought of as involving both a technology of writing and a process of translation, meaning, though, not necessarily translation between different instances or dialects of a natural language, but translation from the language of ordinary common sense to a different kind of representational medium or schema that had, at least for some purposes, greater expressive power. Now, before turning to the next section, let me just say that obviously early modern India, Mughal North India, was not unique in these forms of calculative rationality. Long before the turn of the 19th century, similar sources of economic literacy are found in other parts of the world, well outside of the birthplaces, supposed birthplaces of Western economics, or Western birthplaces of modern economics. Sophisticated imperial states like the Qing or the Ottomans obviously were always looking for opportunities, ways to increase their ability or capacities to calculate. And of course, even beyond the bureaucratic level of the state, much the same would hold true in society. So just think of merchants. Merchants above all are, those who are, versed in dealing with coin and bullion, commodities that were inherently divisible and fungible. And they, especially were familiar with the threefold uses of money that we attribute to money today as a unit of account, as a store of value, and as a means of payment. Now, what is the significance, though, of these early modern forms of economic literacy for understanding later efforts by thinkers like Iqbal to translate scientific Western economics into Urdu? Now, one answer is that it implies there's a deeper history to the thirst for economic knowing in North India, and one that existed at least partly outside of the projects of colonial modernization. Whether or not the economy existed in early modern times, Indian actors were clearly using complex epistemic technologies to grapple with processes of economic production, distribution, and exchange that clearly did exist. The second answer is that the forms that calculative rationality took during Mughal times are an important part of the inheritance that the Indo-Islamic past would have left to these Urdu litterateurs who are starting in the 1840s to try to translate these texts. Now, a final way that these early modern genres of economic literacy prove significant for understanding an effort like Iqbal's to translate modern scientific economic ideas into Urdu is that it really forces us to consider what exactly made those ideas either distinctly modern or scientific. Now, going back to sort of the slide with laying out the sort of Tabir literature and thinking about high Islamic thought as producing a kind of economic knowledge. I think it's worth pointing out that to the extent that that's a response to something you can think about through the lens of Schumpeter's thesis, it's not necessarily a response to denying pre-modern economics a scienticity. In other words, that's a response to Schumpeter's claim that there's really no one other than the Greeks who before the 19th century had anything that would approach what he calls economic analysis. So that Tabir literature is interesting, though at the same time the image you kind of get out of it is not necessarily all that much different than the image you get out of Greek notions of the oikos. It's not to say that that's totally derivative of Greek notions, but in a sense it's reproducing a similar kind of epistemology of the economic. So whether you grant that or not, that as the sort of that Tabir literature, the literature of administering the household and sort of the city, whether you grant that some notion of moniker of economicness, it would still not quite get you to what is modern economics quite doing. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about some ideas about what makes modern economics modern in this next section. So as I was saying, a final way that these early modern genres of economic literacy prove significant for understanding effort like Iqbal's to translate modern scientific ways of knowing is that it raises this question kind of fiercely of what exactly makes those ways of knowing particularly scientific or modern. Now, I would suggest that the above examples of calculative rationality that I was focusing on do share many of the most important features that internalist historians, prominent internalist historians of economic thought have highlighted when trying to deal with this vexing question of what is it really about modern economics that's scientific. Now in her 2012 book, depicted in this slide, the esteemed historian of science, the LSE's Mary Morgan, argues that ever since classical labor-based theories of value started giving way to neoclassical theories of marginal utility, neoclassical theories of marginal utility value after 1870, economics has been distinguished by its practitioners' specific way of representing their ideas about the world. And for Morgan, the hallmark of modern economics was found not really in mathematics per se, but what she calls model making. And on this view, the economist's ideas are scientific because they're represented through what she calls a formalizing language that creates both models of the world and a world in its model. Now I'm not going to sort of go through these two slides, but suffice to say Morgan's idea is that you have, what kind of distinguishes modern economics is that you have these format languages. And here, these are two examples taken from her. The one on the right, of course, is probably more familiar to people. Those are Alfred Marshall's famed supply and demand diagrams from his Principles of Economics. This is actually a blueprint of a machine that was actually built, a hydraulic machine in the early 1950s that was used to model flows of money around the US economy. So the idea here, though, for Morgan is that these are both, in a sense, format languages. One is the language of graphical equations, and one is the language of hydraulics and fluid dynamics. So details aside, even if Morgan's is a reasonable image of how modern economists work and think, once compared even to just the abbreviated catalog of economic literacy in Mughal times that I just gave, it is kind of difficult to see what makes these either modern or scientific still. For example, as a medium of calculative rationality, wasn't Mahajani also complex format language, not to mention one that was different from ordinary verbal language, or as different as the graphical equations that Marshall was using in his supply and demand diagrams. Now, likewise, in using numerical and tabular representation, didn't Abu al-Fazl create a model of the world with a world in its model? Now, in asking these questions, I'm not trying to suggest that they're easy to answer. I mean, you don't ask them any sooner than you also likely start wondering if something like Abu al-Fazl's tax tables really do rival even just what would be modern economics' first great model, the famed zigzag diagram of the French economy that was put together by Francois Quesnay, the great physiocrat. Now, even if so, though, it should still be clear that any categorical distinction, I think, between modern scientific economics and pre-scientific economics is, at the very least, difficult to specify. Now, here in coming back to South Asia, I think it's worth remembering what, in the context of ordinary verbal language, the recently departed historian Christopher Bailey called the difference between literacy as a specialized skill confined to scribal elites in pre-colonial times and the broader social awareness of literacy that was important to the making of pre-colonial state and society. Now, when epistemic traditions are seen according to Bailey's distinction between literacy and literacy awareness, the line between lay and expert knowledge becomes porous in any given historical moment and shifting across long periods. So just as we can't understand verbal literacy as a form of expertise without understanding the way it both generated and was generated by broader forms of literacy awareness, something similar holds true for economic literacy as well. And this is true for the colonial period, I think, too, to which I'm now going to turn. Because here too we must see that the new sciences of the economy that Britain was bringing to India both generated and were generated by other broader economistic idioms that were operating in society at large. Now, this porous and shifting boundary between literacy and literacy awareness, and in the larger argument that I would make between ordinary verbal and formalizing scientific languages, makes Iqbal's Ilm-ul-Iqtesād an especially interesting text. Because as a work that was expressing the academic insights of the day in the Urdu vernacular, whether it was a book of economics proper or simply a work meant to foster awareness of matters economic among Indians, I think has to remain an open question. Certainly Iqbal's text was more complex as a fund of ideas than either what remained of the Mughal-era traditions of calculative rationality that I discussed earlier, or even than the first, his own predecessor translations by other Urdu litterateurs going back to the 1840s. Those more basic efforts at translation had started in 1845 when Pandit Dharam Narayan prepared an Urdu version of the American economist Francis Wayland's 1837 text, The Elements of Political Economy. And importantly, Narayan's effort occurred side by side with the emergence of the first attempts to really institutionalize translation of Western scientific learning into Urdu, which were occurring at Delhi College as in the 1840s also, as Margaret Purnell has emphasized. Now, of course, these efforts to institutionalize Urdu translation later shifted to the city of Aligarh with the founding of the famed Anglo-Mohammedan College there in 1875. And while we do know that by the 1910s, the center of gravity for translating useful or scientific learning into Urdu again shifted southward to the city of Hyderabad at Osmania University. Too little is known about the role of Lahore, from where Iqbal was working in this same process. There are some new scholars who are beginning to try to fill this gap in his work on the Muslim literateur Muhammad Iqbal, who migrated to Lahore from Delhi after the 1857 rebellion. Jeffrey Diamond has highlighted how the newly annexed city was subject to heated kinds of debates precisely about vernacularizing instruction, higher education instruction, and to what extent Urdu should be used in higher education for the purposes of using what was identified in those debates as useful knowledge, which was sort of a euphemism or a code word for Western learning in general and sort of technical and scientific knowledge in particular. So by the turn of the 20th century, there's good reason why in crafting the Ilm-ul-Iqtesad, Iqbal should have been trying to move beyond simple translation, with several decades of vernacularizing ferment in Lahore already behind him, at least 4 or 5 decades. His book was a synthetic work drawing on a range of English language texts from different paradigms of Western economics. Before turning to the specific economists he drew upon, let me just contextualize Iqbal's efforts a bit further in terms of his own personal biography rather than Lahore's history as a post-Delhi and post-Aligarh center of Urdu translation. Now, when he completed his work on the Ilm-ul-Iqtesad, Iqbal was neither the poet nor the political thinker that history now remembers him as. In 1904, he was only just over 25 years of age, and he was an equal number of years removed from he was an equal number of years in 1904 removed from the year 1930, which is sort of the year when he releases his most celebrated philosophical work. People likely know him for the Reconstruction of Religious Thought in Islam. 1930 was also the year that he delivers his famed speech to the All India Muslim League in Allahabad, which is often seen or depicted as the speech where he's articulating an image or a proposal for the founding of Pakistan as a separate national homeland for Indian Muslims. In 1904, Iqbal hadn't even yet traveled to the West for study, so he goes first to England, where he earns his BA at Trinity College in 1904, and then by 1907 he's in Germany, where he's working under the Orientalist Fritz Hammel, and he does his doctorate there on metaphysics, the Persian metaphysical tradition. So instead, when he completed the Ilm-ul-Iqtesad, Iqbal had only just finished his 4th year as a reader in Arabic at the University Oriental College in Lahore, where he was also charged with teaching political economy. Now at the time, not only was economics teaching in British India in its infancy, but the higher education system was only barely coming together. As the historian David Arnold notes, before 1900, little scientific research was conducted in any Indian university, and any kind of significant changes came only after the appointment of the Viceroy Curzon and his assembling of a universities commission. There was a subsequent Indian Universities Act passed in 1904. So the emergence of any kind of research university system is only post-dating by the time Iqbal has already left and during the period when he's teaching economics. In any event, when Iqbal was appointed to teach political economy at Lahore University, the curriculum was not set. From the texts he taught from, therefore, I think we can learn a great deal about the different varieties of Western economic knowing that informed the Ilm-ul-Iqtesad. For first and second years, students whose medium of instruction was Urdu, Iqbal taught from the 1863 book called A Manual of Political Economy by the former chair of political economy at Cambridge, Henry Fawcett, who preceded the great Alfred Marshall in that role. Through several later editions, Fawcett's book became an abbreviation for John Stuart Mill's absolutely canonical 1848 text, The Principles of Political Economy. So Fawcett was essentially following Mill's somewhat confused but still pre-marginalist, and I'll come back to marginalism as a theory of value in a bit, but Fawcett was largely abbreviating Mill's somewhat confused but still pre-marginalist view of economic value. For students after the second year who were instructed in English, Iqbal taught from the American economist Francis Walker's Political Economy, which was an 1888 text that he was also asked to translate. Now, unlike Fawcett or Mill, in Walker, Iqbal found a thinker who was clearly inspired by marginalist theories of value, which had emerged independently in Britain, France, and Austria only between 1864 and 1874. So Walker shared in the idea of economic value as proportionate not to the labor embodied in a commodity, but to the subjective pleasure garnered from whatever the last or marginal increment of the commodity that was still worth the consumer's while to consume relative to other consumption choices. So Walker was echoing the more sophisticated ideas of his famous American peer, John Bates Clark, who, along with Marshall in Britain, had extended the application of marginalism from the behavior of the consumer to the behavior of the firm. So it was John Bates Clark and Alfred Marshall who perfected a neoclassical theory of income distribution based on supply and demand, a topic that had previously been handled largely through a kind of class analysis. In the process, John Bates Clark and Marshall did away with the notion that was suggested and at the heart of economic debate already with David Ricardo by the early 19th century, that market society was predicated on capital owners expropriating more than what their own contribution to the production process really amounted to. And by the time the Punjab Textbook Committee had asked Iqbal to work on the Ilm-ul-Iqtesad, Marshall's principle was readily available in India. And by that point, it had already gone through several editions. It was a sensation from the time it first sort of came out, and really did replace John Stuart Mill's text as kind of the canonical textbook for teaching economics, at least in the English-speaking world. So as I mentioned earlier, exactly whether Iqbal's text was an attempt at forging an Urdu language, science of economics, or just a way of promoting economistic awareness to an Indian reading public through a popular idiom must be an open question. On the one hand, the Ilm-ul-Iqtesad was much shorter and less technical than any of the different sources he drew upon. On the other hand, in contrast to the more basic Urdu translations of his predecessors, Iqbal's goal of synthesis required that he mediate between different paradigms of scientific economics. And indeed, by 1900, whether those different paradigms were really commensurable with one another was a deep question of debate within the world of economists. And indeed, and so it's in this sense that I'm suggesting that the Ilm-ul-Iqtesad should be seen as involving a project of translation not only between English and Urdu, but between Mill and Fawcett's more classical language of economic science and the neo-classical departure figures like Walker and Marshall were making. So to further illustrate this, the way these sort of two tasks of translation were operating, let me say a little bit more about a couple of features of the text itself. So first, in its overall organization, I think what most stands out about Iqbal's text is how he splits the difference between the sources he's using. So whereas Fawcett follows Mill in what was for the classical economists a standard arrangement of topics, starting with production, moving to distribution, and then only incidentally coming to exchange before ending with the topic of taxation and government, Walker was more like Marshall. He began with reflections of a neoclassical flavor on economics as a methodologically individualist discipline. Also like Marshall, he prioritized exchange over production and distribution and introduced consumption, understood now as demand satisfaction, as an entirely new topic. For his part, Iqbal begins his own text with methodological reflections, rather like Marshall's and Walker's, on sort of the method, the individualist method of economics. But then he kind of takes a right turn or left turn and proceeds to launch into a discussion in the first part of the book of what he calls production, the production, exchange, and distribution of dawlat, or wealth. Now, these three concepts he respectively renders as dawlat ke padayesh, dawlat ka tabadla, and dawlat ke paidawar ke hissedar, so wealth, productions, division holders. And although the texture of Iqbal's discussion most often echoes Marshall and Walker, especially in the way he too kind of reimagines production as a kind of productive consumption, his concern with the production and distribution of dawlat among the different social classes has a more classical feel, as does the way he really generally he de-emphasizes demand, which he calls mang, and demand satisfaction through consumption, and there he uses the sort of traditional term used in Islamic sort of economic thinking, sarf. Instead, he combines these topics to a single chapter at the end of the Ilm-ul-Iqtesad, groups them together with questions about population and the difference between necessaries and luxuries that are, very much out of an early 19th century economics text. The twofold nature of the translation task Iqbal was engaged in, I think, between English and Urdu and between these different paradigms of scientific economics is also illustrated in his approach to standardizing or finding terminology. As he notes in the introduction to his book, whatever previous history there was in Urdu to translating these texts going back to the 1840s, he really found it deficient, so he hadn't found that a reasonable sort of set of vocabulary had emerged from those efforts that he could simply borrow. So for his own part, he explains that what he's going to do is rely on his own wits to achieve a similar air to what he says English books of science by economists are able to achieve. And for him, practically speaking, this meant sourcing equivalents for terms that didn't yet exist in the ordinary Urdu lexicon. And by ordinary Urdu here, I think I should remind us that what I mean is really the lexicon of everyday North Indian Hindustani. So he's sort of making up for the deficit through usages he's gleaning from Arabic newspapers, primarily newspapers, Egyptian newspapers, and partly just through his own creativity. Because again, he kind of doesn't think there's enough of a sufficient heritage to what's preceded him to sort of just start where his fellow translators do. So let me just say a bit more about his treatment of the crucial concept of value. So in section 3 of the Ilm, he's dealing with the question of exchange, or dawlat ka tabadla, and Iqbal devotes the first chapter here to different theories of value, and he uses the term qadr for value. In the rest of it is discussion of qadr. Iqbal adheres quite closely to Walker's view on value and argues that qadr is another name for the tabadla ka kavat, or the power of exchange. He even explicitly denies that things acquire value because they cost labor to produce, but at the same time his discussion makes it a point to stop short of Walker's in important ways. So most notably, contra Walker, he does not insist that only the last appreciable quantity of utility, meaning the marginal quantity of it, was the true arbiter of value. And really, Iqbal's refusal to portray qadr purely as utility is really, I think, like his choice to follow Fawcett in framing the economist's overall concern as being less about the logic of maximizing over infinite wants and more really about producing dawlat, or producing wealth. And that clearly has kind of an echo of what the classical economists would just start from, which would be the production of value. Where does value come from? So in creating standardized terms for concepts, Iqbal wasn't simply picking loose equivalents from some one language of everyday life rather than another, or thereby selecting some one range of pre-existing connotations over those that might attach to an alternative choice. He was instead specifying items in a technical lexicon meant to refer to elements within the new social world of the economy that it was the very purpose of that lexicon to make transparent. So in this sense, the most interesting aspect of Iqbal's task was not necessarily how he opted for Arabic or even Persian as his source language for new terms rather than Sanskrit. As historians of the late 19th century Hindi-Urdu controversy in South Asia have often pointed out about just the development of high Urdu literary culture. Instead, more notable, or I'd like to suggest more notable, was his need to find equivalents for purportedly scientific concepts that even in the languages of the West were still highly in flux at the beginning of the 1900s, given that they made reference to two different model worlds of the economy, this fight that was going on between the classicals and the neoclassicals. So with this last observation, now let me move to a kind of conclusion. So when he completed the text in 1904, he was not only 25 years removed from the high point of his career as a philosopher and nationalist in 1930, he was also 2.5 years removed from the date when the Muslim League, the sort of founding organization of Pakistan, is even founded. It's not happening until 1906. So also, at the time Iqbal was writing, British India had really not even witnessed its first episode of mass nationalist agitation with the Swadeshi movement in Bengal and its pioneering tactic of economic boycott against the British. So when Iqbal was writing the Ilm, the main context of communitarian disquiet surrounding him, or a much more sort of prominent context of communitarian disquiet, was still that which had followed the overall decline of the North India's Muslim gentry class. Now that decline, of course, had been in progress ever since the turn of the 19th century, but it really became much more self-consciously lamented only after Bahadur Shah II, the last nominal Mughal emperor, was finally deposed in 1862, and only after the Raj was growing more openly suspicious of Islam as a source of unrest after the rebellion of 1857. Now, because there was still no plausible claim to a unified Indian Muslim community, at this point, the circumstances that were prompting the former Muslim gentry to really start speaking in the name of one were really only still emerging, coming together in the early 1900s. And even by Iqbal's time, when he's a reader in economics, the politics of divide and rule through the creation of separate electorates in India, separate electorates for Muslims, that is, has not really emerged in this period when he's teaching economics. Nor by this time do you have like a proper fragmentation of what historians sometimes call North India into this realm of one language with two scripts, and the sort of division of the previous Hindustani lingua franca into two very, very distinct kind of languages, the two distinct languages mapped onto sort of two religious communities of Hindi and Urdu. And until recently, really, this is kind of how historians sort of continue to view sort of the genesis of Urdu and its increasing refinement. But I think more recently there's scholars like Kavita Duttla who've been complicating this picture of Urdu as being a language linked to religious community and expression. In looking at the founding of Hyderabad's Osmania University in 1918, she talks about or thinks about Urdu as a language of secular Islam, and by this she means a means of ecumenical communication, the further standardization of which was built not really so much by a desire to lay claim to a separate religious identity, but just really the need to tackle new horizons of knowledge like others were in the early 20th century. So on this view, I think language change refreshingly becomes more than a function simply of identity construction. It also is revealed to be more clearly a function of the challenges of translation. And a further benefit of this view is that it really pushes us, I think, to expand our view of the history of translation practices, and it kind of redirects us from Orientalist projects of examining Hindu and Muslim scriptural texts. Duttla is very much concerned with the neglected efforts of Indian actors like Maulvi Abdul Haq, the head of Osmania University's Translation Bureau, to render Western learning into Indian language. Again, not for really the purposes of identity construction as such. As my argument shows, though, I think, or is trying to imply, I think there's still a shortcoming in a view like Duttla's, and that's because it fails to adequately capture, I think, the true scope of the challenge that translation had come to pose by the start of the 20th century. For historians of political and social modernity in Africa and Asia, translations often, or I think in a sense too often, confined to the problem of mediating between different natural language traditions. But this is really belied by the whole immense weight of so much of the intellectual history of the first half of the 20th century. After all, it was really after Gottlob Frege's work and Bertrand Russell's in the early 20th century that for philosophers in the analytical tradition, the real problem of translation was about the commensurability between ordinary language and our languages of scientific knowing. Because there also clearly existed a question about commensurability in the economics context of different languages of economics, the classical and the neoclassical. Part of my hope in sort of this talk and in the book project more generally is to insert South Asia, insert a text like the Ilm-ul-Iqtesad into a different kind of lineage of early 20th century language development, politics, and sort of the production of knowledge. So I think ultimately the talk has attempted to broaden, as I just said, these lineages of knowledge production to which a text like the Ilm-ul-Iqtesad can be made to belong, and really by extension to, in the larger argument, to broaden sort of the lineages of the intellectual history to which a place like South Asia or even a thinker like Iqbal can be made to belong. This text is not just about asserting an identity for Urdu, a literary identity linked to a religious community. The text is about mediating between an area of scientific knowing that's deeply in flux at the same time. So maybe I'll end it with that.